There we go. So we'll do the welcome with my little wobbly welcome sign there. So we're halfway through chapter 17. As I said, by Christmas we should have got to the end of the chapter. So I'll just kind of say what I was just saying to everyone a second ago. There were slightly too many verses to do it in one slot, so we're not finishing it today. But instead we've got two kind of shortish weeks. So we've just got, as we can see, what's that, 7 verses we're looking at, 8 verses today, because they're inclusive. So Matthew 17, 14 to 21. We're following on from Jesus having retreated, or not retreated, having gone up the mountain, which I suspect is Mount Hermon, coming down the mountain, but he's gone up with just Peter, James and John. He's come down, and the rest of the disciples have been down at the foot of the mountain somewhere. And that's the kind of context as we come now into the text. So when he came down to the crowd, and so we're suddenly thrown into the crowd. Well, who's the crowd? We've forgotten about the crowd. We haven't talked about them for a while. But here's one of these interesting situations. If you look at Matthew's gospel, uses roughly half the words, Greek words or English words, doesn't really matter. I say roughly. So if you look at the English or the Greek words, only uses half the amount of words that Mark's gospel, for instance, uses. Now that's not uncommon. Mark's gospel is the shortest gospel, but the stories it tells in a lot more detail. So often from Mark, in these kind of situations where Matthew is being very abbreviated, we get a little bit more of the context. So it's worth flagging that up front, because we're going to run through. We'll notice that there are potentially different things you could illustrate from this story as we kind of fit it together with the version in Mark. But therefore Matthew is wanting to kind of keep it straightforward and simple. Again, if I kind of spelling out my understanding of the Matthew's gospel representing the apostles' kind of doctrine, the teaching of the apostles that is there when they're all together in Jerusalem. Mark's gospel representing Peter expounding from that, kind of adding the colour as an eyewitness that he often does. He does less events, but he tells them with more detail. So here we're seeing Matthew's agenda in some of the things he'll leave out. So he comes down, there is a crowd. We read about it when Jesus comes down to meet the disciples as they're approaching. They see there's a huge crowd around them, you see. So we don't know anything about how they've come together, but now we're here in Matthew, there is a crowd. And instantly we find out the man came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is mentally afflicted and suffers miserably. He frequently falls into the fire and often into the water." You get a little bit more, as I say, if you're looking in Mark's gospel about there being the things going on. There's obviously been some period of time going on. And as we're going to see, there's been a failure of the disciples to be able to actually help this man. I've put the little phrase "mentally afflicted." Sometimes you'll see it's translated as having seizures, sometimes as having epilepsy. And Mark's gospel is more explicit in saying he's demon afflicted. It's just interesting the kind of the choice of words. The actual Greek word is moonstruck. So I think the King James therefore translates that word as a lunatic. Obviously that been affected by the moon, and it's quite a general word. And it kind of illustrates something which was a kind of a confusion really to the ancient world. Where does this come from? We're not sure. We're not instantly calling it demonic, but instantly, because of course it hits the psychology of the individual, it affects them in a way that we don't really understand. It's not like a physical illness. And so I've often kind of wondered what's really going on here. Obviously, there is a demon that leaves him, so that's kind of involved within the flow of the text. But there's this kind of mysterious ailment, and we can imagine ourselves in, and from the things that are described, he frequently falls into the fire and often into the water. Mark's gospel says it's a mute spirit. And I'm often, I read that, and I often used to think it's very strange. Lots of people in the ancient world seem to not be able to talk, you know. Now, it's certainly true, for instance, that a lot of kind of there are a lot of ailments that we understand nowadays, right the way from styles of autism that kind of restrict people's ability to speak. But alongside that, there's also obviously something physical that sometimes gets him, that he falls down, and so on. And so there's often in my head, and just kind of playing these things out, I've often tried to wonder what exactly is happening with the man. Is it all demonic? Is it something that we might kind of diagnose in other ways? And I suspect there's an element of the two. That it certainly seems that the root comes down to something being driven out. If I think back on my own experience with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, when I was actually prayed for, the guys that came in with the church eldership into the hospital, and two guys who laid hands on me, they spoke to the disease as if it was demonic, and it left. So there is a kind of a sense where in my own mind I wouldn't kind of use the language of demonization or oppression, but there is that kind of sense in which all of these things ultimately root back to the demonic, and so you can get all of those kind of blending bits together. So that's a very waffly way to kind of just say I've often observed something, I've never really kind of concluded on it. The way that different translations sometimes give it a physical kind of bias and others give it more of a spiritual. You definitely has a spiritual because you find those in the other Gospels and so on. So anyway, so there's a situation going on. Jesus had come in, and so it says, so I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And I think this is right at the heart of Matthew's agenda, because there are some other things that pop up in agendas that you could imagine kind of the focus comes onto. So the kind of in the conversation that ensues with the man. But I think that what we're going to see is there's a kind of we've been hitting a key moment in Matthew's gospel. Things have been kind of building up to a crescendo, and there's a real tussle and a battle going on. So there's the declaration of faith, where Peter has talked about, you are the Son, you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. So recognizing both the Messiahship and the divinity of Jesus in Peter. Then the struggle, get behind me, Satan. Because actually you don't want to suffer, you shouldn't have to do that, no way. And that struggle or the temptation, which we see reflected in the in Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he says, we kind of hear, if possible, take this cup away from me. There's something in Jesus that would like to do what Peter is saying, but actually in his humanity he has to struggle through and suppress some of those natural instincts of his humanity, in order to do the Father's will, which is ultimately his Spirit's greater pleasure. So that we see the struggle in those verses. And then we've gone up the mountain, and actually we've seen how the revelation as it grows, as Moses, the prophet, comes after Moses, he's beloved, there's something of the bridegroom. There's this kind of layer on layer of incredible revelation. And he's more important than Moses, he's more important than Elijah, who stands for the prophet. And now as they come down the mountain, there is something in the disciples which is fading again. So it sort of parallels what's happened with Peter just a few verses before, a chapter before, where he's gone from kind of great faith to suddenly struggling in understanding God's purposes. So they've brought this man to the disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And Jesus responded, "O faithless and thoroughly screwed up generation." Now, you may not have seen that phrase, thoroughly screwed up generation, but it is there. The Greek word starts with dia, which means to go through something. So a diagonal goes through a rectangle, your diaphragm is sort of in the middle, it's through you. So that dia always kind of means through, and thorough is another way of expressing through. A through, and then the follow, I just remember what the Greek word is, but it means to be twisted. So it's thoroughly twisted, you see. So in a more modern vernacular, I've gone for thoroughly screwed up, but I've hyphenated it all as one word, because I think you can see all of those parts in the Greek word. So Jesus' response is, you have a situation going on, there is a man involved, there are disciples involved, and then Jesus extends the scope to the entire generation, O faithless and thoroughly screwed up generation. How long must I put up with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked him. And the demon went out from him. See, so here is the clear demon. So we've started with him being moonstruck, i.e. there's something odd that we don't really get. It's mysterious, but here there's a demon involved. And the boy was healed from that hour. And Jesus is now going to turn his attention towards the disciples. So the disciples are going to raise the question. I'm going to stay with these verses for the time being. Because what I really should have done, because I'm trying to pull it from memory, I should have had the Mark passage up in front of me. Is you read the Mark passage, the response to this idea of faithless and thoroughly screwed up generation is the man takes it on very personally, because he sees his own unbelief in it, and he cries out, help me in my unbelief, you see. And that would draw attention to the unbelief of the father. But I think Matthew wants to avoid that. He wants to keep the focus on the wider perspective that Jesus has kind of drawn attention to, because we're also going to see there's something of a failure in the disciples. So now, as someone who's gone through the experience of being healed and has also prayed for a lot of folks who have been unwell, there is often this kind of question. We know that faith is involved, but there's a kind of a pastoral care that we need to take. Because there's often a criticism made, if you like, of faith healing ministries, is that they put the blame for the failure of faith healing on the individual. It's your fault, you haven't got enough faith. Other times, if we want to kind of berate those who are trying to step into faith, into a life of faith by prayer for things, we can blame them. Well, if you'd had more faith, then that person wouldn't have died, you see. And there's something very kind of unkind in all of that. But I think what's really key to notice here is Jesus gives a much broader context to the lack of faith. Faith is clearly an element. And where does it lie? Sometimes it seems to lie in the individual who's looking for healing, because we've had that where Jesus responds to the centurion, I've not seen such faith in all of Israel, and then go because your son has been healed, and he says to the person, your faith has made you well. So it's true that somehow faith sometimes resides in the heart of the individual seeking healing, or doesn't. Sometimes it's in the heart, as we're going to see, because Jesus gives a challenge to the disciples of the person who is being requested to act in faith, to speak out in faith. That if you really had faith, like a mustard seed, it's going to kind of say. So there's faith there in the individuals and the disciples. But actually, we've got to be very cautious at kind of at saying where the faithlessness lies, if I can put it that way, because actually sometimes it is the seeping around of the whole generation. It puts me in mind, for instance, of when Jesus talks about that he couldn't do many miracles in Chorazin and Bethsaida. You see that there's something within the cultural context, and some of the concern, it seems to me, for Jesus is that we've gone through this moment where his disciples seem to be emerging into a phase that allows Jesus to kind of now go to fulfill his destiny in his death, with confidence that those who've been with him and walked with him have understood something and are going to live it out and take it further. And I think there's a kind of a question mark here. The good news is Jesus doesn't change his plans. He still heads south, and everything culminates within about 8 months of what we're reading about here, in Jesus' death and resurrection. So he continues with it. But you can see the concern now is there's something, though, that my disciples could have had, which is not the focus that the man necessarily should have had, even though the man says, help me on my unbelief. He could have had faith, or he might not, but he came with desperation and just a vague hope. But there's something about his disciples that somehow couldn't do what it is that Jesus is able to do. And he uses he locates their faithlessness with something that's slightly broader and cultural. And I, in a strange way, I find it it's challenging, but it also is helpful to see, because I often in my own self, I've seen some most remarkable miracles, but I know the challenge of faith, and that I can think of times where the Lord has done beyond my own faith 100%. I've been asked often when you're in a leadership role. You will be asked to pray for things, and as you're praying for them, you're thinking to yourself, if you're really honest, you're thinking, I don't really have faith for this, but I need to go through it because I've been asked, and go through the motions, put my hands on them. So probably not dissimilar to the disciples. In fact, I'll tell one story, which I've told several times, so you may have heard it before, but I can remember I'd been walking my dogs with another guy in the church, and he told me about his brother who'd been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And I met his brother a few times, and I remember saying to him, I said, well, I tell you what you should do to this guy. I said, you should say to your brother that I'd be willing to pray for him, you see. So that sounds very faithful, doesn't it, But as we walked on, I said the trouble is, I said, in reality, I've never even heard of anybody being healed from Parkinson's disease. And so really, I realised as I reflected on myself that I wasn't saying I'll talk to him because I've got faith that he'll be healed from Parkinson's. I'm saying I'll pray for him because actually I want to use his Parkinson's to kind of manipulate him into the fact he ought to be a Christian. Now, he ought to be, but that's not the way to do it, It's like Paul writes, I want your goodness to be not to be under compulsion. You don't want to use someone's, while the Lord often meets people in their pain and vulnerability, you don't want to become a manipulative person who uses their vulnerability to kind of notch up a success on your tally for how many people have got saved through you. So I realised that although I was offering to pray for him, I didn't really have faith for that situation. I was just using his vulnerability. And then I've often told the story. It was the very next day, a guy came up at church who had got Parkinson's, had it for a number of years, but we'd just left it. We weren't praying for it, and because he was just so delighted. He got saved some months before through Alpha, and his depression had lifted, and he'd been so happy because his depression had lifted, and so we'd never really kind of pushed through, and everyone referred to him as Shaky Dave because he shook, And he came up today, he was crying, and he said, I'm fed up with this disease. I really don't want it, And he said, I want you to pray for me. And as soon as he said, I want you to pray for me, I had the conviction of my own faithlessness in this, my lack of faith. and so I did, what's the best thing to do in that is to look around for someone who's got more faith than you. And so I shouldn't be laughing. It's just telling you these vulnerable stories about my own failings and these things. And I saw a guy called John who'd recently he'd been healed by the Lord. He'd had years where he'd been signed off work with ME. He'd now got energy back. After a week after he got healed, he started up a gardening business just to show how healthy he was now. So I thought he'll have faith, and I called him over, and he told me afterwards when he realised I wanted him to pray for Shaky Dave, he said I had no faith whatsoever. And so I actually said, the first thing I said in my head when I was praying for the guys, I repented and said, sorry, Lord, I've got no faith. I'm really sorry about this. I recognise what I was confessing yesterday. And now I've got to pray as if I've got faith, and that's just really deceptive. So I started to just pray generally about the goodness of God, And I kind of, and then I felt the Lord say, you should never have called him Shaky Dave, you see. And there's that little phrase that says faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So if God says something, that's often something you can latch faith onto, And so I remember thinking to myself, okay, so I thought, okay, what I need to do is I prayed out loud and said, Dave, we should never have called you Shaky Dave. You see, he'd introduced himself that way. It's what people around town called him. He used to be a landlord in the pub in Maidenhead. So that they'd called him Shaky Dave. He'd introduced himself that way, and that's what we called him. So I apologised before the Lord, said we never should have done. And then I felt my kind of faith rise a little bit. And I just thought, okay, now I can pray with positively. Kind of cleared the air of my faithlessness, and we prayed. And so many of you know the story because within 3 days later I heard from him. He'd taken him 3 days to be convinced he'd been healed, but the next day he'd got up in the morning, he had a little dog that he walked with, and he'd walk with a stick because he was shaking. The dog started pulling, and he started to run with it, and he suddenly realised he was running without holding his stick and wasn't falling over, you see. But the thing was, so the Lord is very good in that he often takes us out of our faithlessness and raises it to faith. And I don't fully always understand, because even the faith we have often comes out of the dialogue. And so I want to kind of highlight that the word that is used, the faithless word, it's apistis. Pistis is kind of truth or reality, and it's living out of that, is without that reality. That we often think of it as so again, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. How I was going to describe it. So we often think of it in terms of I believe really hard for this thing. And because I believe really hard for it, do I believe hard enough in that moment? But actually, it's also used in the more broad sense, which is my faithfulness to the simple disciplines of life. And that clearly kind of, I think, creeps into the answer, because as we kind of look through the text, so the disciples having to come to Jesus in private said, "For why?" Again, slightly different translation, but there is a reason for it. Actually, funny enough, it's the same Greek letters, the dia, but the often translates as "because why." It's kind of "because why" is the Greek. So I've gone for why, but often for good English, people compress them and it will just say why. Why weren't we able to cast it out, or for what reason? But it's kind of doubled up the question, for why. Why weren't we able to cast it out? And Jesus said, "For your non-faith." So different texts have slightly different. Some say faithless, the same word as before, and others kind of have a prefix which means little. So you've got one or the other. So I've just kind of blended the two ideas. It's your non-faith. It's the diminished size of your faith. Now, for real, I say to you, or really, really, I say to you, or for truth, I say to you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. And I was, if I go back to the story I was sharing, I increasingly I think, because you think, well, how does this work? And I think there's something in that I learned, which I may well have told you the story before, because it was one of those key learning things for me. It's better to work with the faith that you do have, in terms of I really do believe this. So the faith I did have in that prayer was, I knew that we had been, first of all, I was being honest about my own lack of faith. Secondly, I did know we should never have called him Shaky Dave. And I forgot to say, I then said, let me prophesy that this was said by faith, we will call you Rock Solid Dave, I felt I could do that because I felt like the Lord had said something there. He'd said to me, you should never have done that. So that's my little mustard seed bit of faith. But from that, more faith comes, you see. And then sometimes you are able to pray the big thing. Now, I can't say I did it with expectation, but I had stepped up from the mustard seed faith and declared something and stepped into something. And the Lord was able to do beyond what I asked or thought, because I worked with where faith was genuine, if I can put it that way. So say to this mountain, move from here, and it will move. But here's the other observation, which then comes into the final verse that we're looking at today, because he said, now this kind doesn't come out but by prayer and fasting. Now, some of the oldest manuscripts of Matthew don't have this verse in at all. But Mark does, and it's probably true that they didn't write it in originally, but it was there in Mark, and somehow it was always got adopted into the story. But I think it's part of the narrative. It's part of the flow of the focus, particularly as Matthew has told it, which is really on the issues of the disciples, which has been affected by the faithlessness of the community and the culture around them. And how do we get from it? Well, you can have seed that's like a mustard seed and focus on that, focus where real faith is, where do you really believe for the Lord in the moment, or more generally, actually there's a bigger context, because Jesus didn't pray and he didn't fast. He just did it. He rebuked the demonic and it left. But obviously we know he had a habit. We certainly read of his habit of getting up early in the morning to pray, you see. That seems to be a regular part of Jesus' prayer life. And my, again, different areas and different stories, but I find my faith in the Lord is impacted by my faithfulness with the day-by-day disciplines. The more I am saturated in the disciplines of prayer, fasting, even things like, what in my downtime, there are times when I know where I'm much more I feel much more hungry for the kind of the worship music and the context of and other times where I just want to read my book, or I just want to listen to this or watch something on TV. But actually those things often, the more the day-by-day disciplines are in place, the less they become disciplines, the more they become part of the pleasure, and the more they become an expression of faithfulness, that actually means that there's often a greater level of focused faith when I need it, if I can put it that way. So I draw two lessons from it. So there are times when I find we focus mainly on the text, and others where the text kind of opens up these lessons, and I'm just sharing the lessons in one sense. That there is a challenge to me to kind of get the wider sense of a disciplined lifestyle that actually feeds and expresses faithfulness. So not, if you like, the focused faith, but actually the two are both covered. Faith can be focused. I really believe this is going to happen, or is it actually I'm faithful in the general? I spend time with the Lord. I pray. I have the disciplines of fasting and other things that I use with my entertainment, what tracks and so on. The more kind of faithful I am to the presence of God, the easier it is to kind of speak with authority. And the easier it is to recognise what I genuinely have faith with. And then the flip side is what real faith comes by hearing. And actually, therefore, out of that communion with the Lord, there is more that I've heard, more that he's given me. And I start with the things I really have been told. Because I see a lot of praying for the sick is done out of sort of a presumption, because we found a verse that says we should be healed and we presume on the verse. It's not out of the hearing in the experience. So I can often, because I've got quite a few years now behind me of trying to do these things, I can often talk a better game than I can do on the day, because the whole thing all kind of blends into the process. But these are my observations on how the dynamics of prayer for me should work, if that makes sense. And the wonderful thing is, sometimes you get people who, when you don't have any faith, bring the faith to the party. But equally, we shouldn't blame the person who's got the lack of faith like the father had in this. And because actually he, like us, has been affected by a culture of unbelief. And actually the responsibility we have is for bringing the kingdom. So I'm always very cautious of those that say, well, it's your problem, you've got no faith. Yes, sure, if you had some faith, that probably might fix the things. But actually, you've come to me because you're looking for me to be in a better place as well with the Lord. So those are just my, I guess, some observations on this passage, which hits at the kind of the combination, physical, spiritual, our authority to speak into it. I think, as I say, I put it in the context because you see this struggle of actually there's a transition moving on from Jesus with the 12 to now the 12 with their disciples, the 72, who they probably have some responsibility for passing things on to, although Jesus is still there. And right at the heart of that, have they really got these lessons honed in? Because actually one day when Jesus isn't physically with them, they need to have really got them into their systems. And those two things of faithfulness that reflects the broader, wider, how do I express a life faithfully, and also the focused and the kind of we need to now focus it here. How do I do those things? So anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully they're helpful. Does anyone want to ask anything or contribute anything on that?
Can I just mention there's a verse in Matthew 8 where Jesus is healing people and stuff, and it says this was to fulfill the prophecy that by his stripes we healed. I can't remember the exact wording. He bore our sicknesses, and there was a theological debate about whether healing was in the atonement.
Yeah, so that verse is a really badly used one. It's in John, because we put the English translations often put a full stop. So it's so Jesus kind of says, when they say they're having a debate, is it this man or his parents who sinned? And Jesus says neither, full stop. But so that the glory of God could be revealed. Sorry, that's where the full stop is. Neither, but so that the glory of God could be revealed. Full stop. You see, the full stop's not there in the Greek. If you take the full stop out, it reads neither, but that the glory of God might be revealed. Let's do the things that we should do let's do the things of Him who sent me while it's still day. In other words, so Jesus's answer is not neither. It was because God wanted to show His glory and therefore He was ill and I came. I think that's the one you're driving at. 'Cause it's often the contentious one. Therefore, He was sick, so I could come and heal him. But actually, he's saying, in one sense, it's not about who sinned in this situation. Sometimes people are just sick, but actually we can do something about it. So let's do something about it while we still can. While I'm still around, let's address it. And there are other issues about whether healing is in the atonement or not. I tend to think, and sometimes I think the debates are slightly distracting. The fact that there is clearly healing in the atonement in the sense of the Greek word sozo for saved includes healing. And that, we have in the Old Testament, by His stripes, or by His wound, we are healed. There is a clear connection in the Old Testament between issues of healing and so on. The reason people debate it is because they don't see everybody get physically healed. And yet, we would say if they pray the prayer, then everybody should be saved, you see. And so I think that they're making a big conclusion to say that healing is not in the atonement to address a mystery in life that, if I take that other verse from John that I just quoted, sometimes the debate is, why did it happen? Is it this or that? And actually the answer is, well, let's get on and do something about it, if that makes sense. And so I'm not wanting to be dismissive, Colin, of your question at all. I'm just saying I find it hard. The conclusions, while I think it's hard to prove one way or the other, the conclusions very often of those that want to take it out of the atonement are often express a kind of a religious approach to things that I find doesn't fit so well for me. In other words, it becomes there's something about salvation that becomes mechanical rather than relational and kind of more organic. Whereas if we keep it that way, I think then it becomes harder to justify that healing is not covered by the atonement, even if we don't understand why not everybody always gets healed. Is perhaps the best way of putting it. So I think your mic's off, Colin.
Matthew 8:17. He Himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. I think that's the one that's used. So you're saying that healing is covered by the atonement, even though
it certainly seems to me to be in the atonement,
even though we don't understand why.
Sometimes people want to take it out because they'll say, well, if you pray, you get saved. But if you pray to get healed, you don't always seem to get healed. That's the way they see it.
Yeah. So and they'd use that reason to say it isn't in the atonement.
That's often the logic. So
I mean that verse seems quite clear from Matthew 8:17.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying is I think pragmatically there's loads of verses like that where I can't see how you can divorce it from. Yeah. But
I don't understand. I don't understand why not everybody gets healed. Even though I believe that verse, So that's
right. Yeah, and I think and we know that something of faith comes into the mix here, but there you go. But I think probably the unfortunately the theological arguments often force things to be more simple than they should be. So in other words, because it's kind of like, well, if you prayed the prayer in the back of knowing God personally, then are you saved? Some people say, well, no, actually it's got nothing to do with you praying the prayer. It's all by divine election. And others will say, no, everybody that prays the prayer, they're in. In reality, the praying of the prayer is normally a reflection of something that's bigger and broader, which in the end Jesus is the judge and arbiter of. So it's hard to fully, but we don't debate that because that's a big theological battleground. So we avoid that one, and then it falls to secondary issues like healing as well. But I think the thing to do is, you never do any harm by doing the right thing, if I can put it that way. It's the way I often see it. The only thing we're ever told, the model Jesus gives us for prayer is to always pray, your kingdom come, your will be done. So I always say, because like people will say, should I pray for so-and-so to get sick because I don't know, to get well because I don't know if it's God's will for them to be well or not. You see, I say, well, in heaven, will they be sick? No, they won't. So to pray on earth as it is in heaven means I'll pray that they get well. I won't pray anything else. Maybe it is God's will, I don't know, but we're not supposed to pray, we think it's your will, so I don't want to get that wrong. I want to pray in line. We're told to pray on earth as it will be in heaven, or as it is in heaven. So we always go for the positive in that sense, if we live that way.
And there is the argument that Jesus, sometimes walked past people without healing them. But I would say if they really cried out to him, he would always heal them.
Yeah, I think that there is an absolutely you get an impression in which often is seen that there is a harsh truth, which is that actually Jesus comes for the cross, and actually otherwise he could have spent a whole full natural life out in the middle of different places where it wouldn't really matter, praying for the sick, and lots of people would have gone through a temporary relief in life. And we would never have gone through what the purpose of his calling was. And there's an interesting dynamic in that, which I would say our primary focus in terms of is obedience to what the Lord has given us to do. Now, occasionally things push in that are on the outside of that, and that's okay because we are, in our humanity, we react in those moments. But we have to sometimes be careful at not doing what's needed rather than what we've been required to do. That faithfulness means that I need to do what I've been given by the Lord to do. So when Jesus says, he's going through that mental discussion when the woman from Syrophoenicia, who's going to be part of the next wave, not his wave, as the gospel goes out into all of the world, and she's pushing in, and if he gets caught in the ministry and a mission up in Syrophoenicia, he's not going to get back and do the things in the timing he needs to do in Judea. And so we have that verse which we've looked at as we've gone through Matthew that can be a bit embarrassing to read because it seems like he's being rude about her. It's not fit to give the dogs the children's food, you see, but he's actually puts it in the context of his calling, because what I'm called to do is in Judea. It's amongst the children of Israel, and she's Syrophoenician, but that's coming later. He's talked about that coming later, but it's not now. Sorry, that's again a long answer, Colin, but hopefully that will that makes sense. It's the complexity of life with different requirements. Sometimes the call from a Syrophoenician woman comes so close that it now takes priority, but we have to manage life in a way where we can actually do the things God's given us to do.
But thank you.
Good. Any other thoughts, or anyone want to ask anything else or observe anything else?
I think I'm just conscious, Kristen, that in our culture that we're part of the unbelieving generation, really, and I don't know how you feel that impacts. I mean, one of the things we do have is an NHS that encourages us, and rightly so, to access the medical understanding that we have.
Yeah.
How much that tempers our enthusiasm.
No, well, I can't say whether he was right or not, but I remember back in the in the 90s, and when I was involved with across the UK with different denominations in the church planting agenda, I remember meeting with I can't remember if it was Elim or AOG. It's one of the big Pentecostal denominations, meeting with their senior leadership, and they just had a piece of research that had been done by one of their academics, and there were a couple of different, because one of the questions they had was, how did Pentecostal denominations lose some of the power that they had in terms of the healing testimonies? Just being really not in a kind of gung-ho way, but wanting to really understand. And there were a couple of different theories out there. There was one about the fact that then they'd started to kind of put an emphasis on academic ability. So all their ministers had gone through Bible college, rather than just being spontaneous and from the ground up. But one of the interesting ones, someone kind of showed a direct kind of, he was trying to demonstrate, one of the researchers, a direct correlation between the introduction of the National Health Service and the dropping off of the miraculous. And his theory was, as people got less used to praying for small things because they could now go to the doctor, they didn't actually build up the levels of faith that actually meant that they could then push for the big things that the doctor couldn't do anything about, if that made sense. And I totally got his argument. Whether he's correct or not, I don't know. But that was the observation he had. And I can understand the sense of that, because there's something of what I'm saying there. The faithfulness in the general practice of my faith, prayer, the fasting, the Bible reading, the worshipping together, the getting along to church. As I become less as I express more faithlessness, if you like, in that, I'm not so intense about it, then that seems to be part of the framework of the unbelieving generation. And so it's not that the NHS caused people to do that, but it gave an opportunity for them to not have to lean into faith as much. And I suspect that as the world's economic systems collapse over the next few years, I keep on saying this, it's my total expectation that they will, and what we will find is that there are more things we have to become dependent on the Lord. I find myself praying about our fuel bills more than I used to. So just, because that's the reality of all of a sudden they become part of your relational context. So I'm more likely to see a miracle with a fuel bill now than if it wasn't really a bother to me, if I can. But now that'd be nice to try to think of a miracle with a fuel bill. What that looks like. It probably wouldn't make a good Bible story, but I do think there's something. It's not judgmental from the Lord about it, but it is, if you like, almost the physical. It's the faith health of how of when we are in. So actually, go on thinking about as we work through the testimonies of the two Iranian guys we baptized this last week. They're saying they want to see more of the experiences they've read about and they heard about and we talk about sometimes. But then when you talk to them, they've actually had some quite miraculous things happen to them at time. Literally when one guy was walking all the way across Turkey to get to Greece because it's a non-Islamic country, one of the guys, and hasn't eaten for 3 days. And somebody suddenly comes up to him just as he's crying out to the Lord and actually supplies some needs and gives to him stuff and drives him the rest of the way. And actually, suddenly in the place of need, as we cry out, and he hasn't really probably ever. The Lord's clearly speaking to him, but he's not responded in that. But actually, you can see how the Lord is responding to the expressions of faith just in everyday life, and we're more likely to look to him when things are tougher. So we tend to be healthier when things are tougher. But that's not a good message for Sundays. People don't like to hear that kind of stuff. They like the yeah. I was going to say they like the "it will be okay" messages. It will be okay, but you know what I mean.
I was just thinking about your topic as faith in a faithless generation,
Yeah,
which is quite in time. because that's what has happened, either as Joe said, through NHS or other reasons for why we don't really focus more on believing God for provision. But the other question is, how do we build our faith in God? Because I remember the disciples saying, please help our unbelief. I don't know, you just mentioned it very nicely. Sometimes if we are not careful, we might just go on praying while literally we don't even believe what we're praying for. So how can we change that so that we may be able to have faith in God? And as Jesus said, even if it's just as little as a mustard seed, but at least have one.
I think it's a really good question, Joseph. My personal thing is, one of the things I realize is I when I speak, I want to be more honest about my own struggles in it, because I've often learnt my lessons in the struggles, if that makes sense. But so in other words, like when the story I was telling you, I learnt a lesson by getting it wrong. But very often we have a church culture where everyone has to be so perfect and shiny. They've always got it right, so they can never admit those things. So we never learn from people actually the lessons that we get, if I can put it that way. So on a personal level, I'm not saying it's a great solution everywhere else. I just feel like we want to build a culture where it's much easier for us to talk about not the struggles in a cynical way to get everyone down, or it never works. I'm not saying like that, but actually almost with humour, in the sense of, do you know what, we're like this. I can be just like Peter. I can be faith one day and I can be terrible the next day. I can be praying. I can be a total hypocrite, like Jesus talks about, where I can be praying those things because I need to, because I'm supposed to be your church leader. So I can't pretend. I can't let on that I have less faith than you do. But maybe I don't have less faith than you do. You're just pretending too. But let's all be honest about this. And how do we change it? So the question you're asking is, we want to kind of make that part of the truth that we're kind of going, we're trying to work our way through. The flip side is, I love that it's often used, I think, incorrectly, but in Romans, where it talks about faith not in itself, but it's a gift from God. And we often make that something very mysterious. But I often will say, there are people who I know who ask me to have faith in them, and for some they're making a demand on me, and for others they're making me a gift, because if they are faithful, it's a gift to have faith in them. In other words, they've gifted me faith because they're so regularly. They always do what they say they will do. It's no effort to have faith. When they say they'll do it, I just trust them. So they've made faith a gift. And my experience is, as we're more honest and we see answers, we can see. I worked with my mustard seed faith. I knew the Lord wouldn't leave me. I was trying to get home, and I knew the Lord wouldn't leave me stuck here, even though I'd missed the last train. And then something happened where I met someone who'd also missed the train, and we got a cab together, and it only costed so much. That's his faithfulness. If I start to identify the little mustard seed moments of faith and celebrate them, then what I find is I kind of grow in faith for the bigger things. But if we have a fake culture where people only ever share because they prayed for someone who got healed and from cancer, it's a great story. But if those are the only stories we've got, then either we've got to pretend I've got faith when I'm praying for someone with cancer, or I'm never really going to acknowledge that I can pray for something small over here and see the Lord's faithfulness. But when I do pray for something small over here and he's faithful in it, he's gifting me faith, because it makes it easier to believe the bigger things that's sort of my pragmatic approach to how we do it.
It's quite good, actually.
Yeah.
Because it's faithfulness, as you say, that probably leads us to not only understand but practice faith.
Yeah.
So I think you're right.
Good, good.
Sometimes out of dependency, we pray. And
Yeah.
for me, so there are times when little things out of dependency, I pray, and the Lord just does whatever. I'm really surprised.
Yeah.
You know, because, and sometimes I don't even notice that he's answered, but I think it's that it builds that relationship, which is what it's all meant to come out of. That is, I can see, Kristen, that is his faithfulness.
Yeah, that is,
Responding to my need. And I'm not praying thinking that the Lord's going to deliver. I'm just praying because I need him to deliver.
You need him to deliver, yeah. And that's how, as I say, that's where the gift, I think, comes in. Is when when you start to recognise his faithfulness, he's gifting us faith. He's not demanding faith of us. It's kind of, I've done nothing for you, but unless you believe me totally, I'm not going to accept you. It's not the way he works. That's demanding of faith, whereas gifting of faith is, I'll do these little things that you can recognise to see how faithful I am, and then it's easier for you. Anyway, I was going to say, look, we've taken nearly the whole hour, and I said today was a short one. So, obviously, there's something in the subject that needs addressing a lot more. We better kind of finish there.
Thanks, Kristen.
See you next week, the last time before Christmas.